Hi! In this video, I have a really exciting project to share with you. I will be showing you how to make a t-shirt quilt. This is a super easy project and I would consider it to be beginner friendly. So how this quilt came about, I met my husband about 7 years ago. Shortly after we started dating, he had mentioned that one day he really wanted to make a quilt out of all his band t-shirts. So he had slowly been, setting the ones that were worn or didn't fit him any longer aside in order to make a quilt one day. Now, he doesn't sew, but I think maybe he had learned that I did know how to sew, and that's why he shared that with me. But this year we celebrated our second wedding anniversary this last week. But I knew that was coming up, and the second wedding anniversary, the traditional gift is actually cotton. So I decided this would be the perfect gift for that anniversary. If you want to see my husband's reaction to receiving this gift, please head over to my Instagram, which is also Made on Mill, and you can catch that there. I have a full written blog post on my website, which is madeonmill.com. So if you prefer written instructions, you can head over there and read along. Let's get started. I'm actually working at my parents' house to complete this project. My mom kindly offered to give me some childcare support so I could get this done as well. I could leave this project there so my husband wouldn't see it at home. I was able to work on this project over a course of 6 weeks, about 1 day a week and 2 to 3 hours at a time. I noticed on the second day of filming, I actually wore the same outfit as the week before, so I decided I would just continue wearing this outfit for the entirety of the project. For this project, I recommend starting with about 12 to 20 t-shirts. It's going to depend on the size of your quilt and how big you want your quilt pieces to be. I go into further detail in my blog post about this, but for my project, I used 19 t-shirts and I ended up with 23 pieces because I used the front and back of 4 of them. The size of cuts that you make is really up to you. You just want to make sure that either they're all the same size, or if you're using 2 different sizes, that when you go to sew the 2 smaller ones together, you have that seam allowance. So when you open it up, you want it to be the same size as the larger piece. I used a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this project. My final quilt had 4 columns and 4 rows, and this was due to the fact that I didn't want to cut through any of the prints on the t-shirts. I wanted to keep those fully intact. So I ended up with 2 different fabric cuts. The first one was 11.75 inches by 14 inches, and the larger size was 22.5 inches long by 14 inches wide. Now for my quilt, I first cut out my t-shirt cuts and then I applied interfacing to them. I'm now, after doing this, recommending that you apply interfacing to the t-shirt first. The main reason is your t-shirts are probably knit fabric or have a stretch. So applying the interfacing first will actually make them act more like a woven fabric, and you'll get cleaner cuts by doing this. To apply your interfacing, I first laid down my t-shirt on my ironing board with the graphic facing down, and then I put the interfacing over top. I then took a scrap piece of t-shirt and actually put that over the glue, just so there was a little bit less heat. I was actually worried about putting the iron on the graphic, so I thought if I could make the heat a little less intense, then I could protect the graphic. You may also want to protect your ironing board. I didn't actually have any problems, like none of the graphics came off, so I'm sure that yours will be fine as well, but you may want to take some precautions. When applying the interfacing, I find it to be helpful to kind of sit the iron down, wiggle it a little bit in place, and then once you're done, just pulling back the fabric to make sure it's actually stuck to the interfacing. Once all your fabric cuts are ready, whether you've applied the interfacing before or after you're cutting, it doesn't matter. It's time to go ahead and lay out your pieces and see how you want to arrange your quilt. One thing to note is that I did trim away the excess interfacing from each piece, and it's important that your edges are square and trim before you start sewing. I'm going to start with sewing my columns together. So to stay organized, I'm going ahead and stacking those up in their own piles and labeling them. This project is considered upcycling. I am taking something and giving it a new purpose. Now, we certainly could have donated the t-shirts my husband was no longer using. However, many of them had stains or holes, so I thought this was a great way to use those instead of them going to waste. Also, a lot of clothes unfortunately don't get purchased from secondhand stores, so I figured it would be best for us to use what we already own. Before we get started with assembling the quilt top, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you to subscribe, like, or share this video if you're enjoying the content. To start making our quilt top, you will take two of your pieces which will lie next to each other, and you'll place them together with right sides facing. You'll then pin them in place and stitch along the edges with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can certainly use a different seam allowance. This is just what I had accounted for when I decided what cut sizes I was making. Because the t-shirts are a knit, I found when I was cutting them without the interfacing, they were easily like pulled or stretched, and then the edges were kind of rolling in. So I think this is where my issue stemmed from. But yeah, applying that interfacing first will certainly help with this issue. Now, if you do run into the same issue with me where your pieces aren't totally the same size and they're not lining up, what I recommend doing is trying to get your long sides as parallel as possible. So this means that when you go to put your columns together, the edge of your column are fairly straight. You may need to trim some away, but you're not going to have something that's zigzagging or on a complete angle. Go ahead and keep pinning and sewing until all of your columns are assembled. Before you go ahead and sew the columns together, I recommend pressing your seams. You can do this two ways. One is pressing the seams open, or two is pressing the seams in one direction. Now, for columns that are next to each other, I recommend pushing one column, the seams up, and on the other column, pushing the seams downward. And so when you go to put the columns together, you're going to have less bulk at those seam intersections. To pin your columns together, I recommend first working on your seam intersections, making sure those line up. And the reason for this is that you want your corners to line up pretty nicely on your quilt top. So once those are pinned, then I move on to pinning the space between the seams along the columns. This is an example of one of my cuts that wasn't totally square, so I needed to clean that up. Once your columns are pinned together, you could go ahead and sew them together with a straight stitch and whichever seam allowance you're using. Be careful when sewing over those seams just because you have that extra bulk with the horizontal seam allowance. Now I just need to sew that center column line and my quilt top will be complete. Once your quilt top is finished, you can go ahead and press the seams along your columns there in whichever way you choose to do that. To start assembling the quilt, I'm laying my quilt top down with the right side facing the floor, and then I'm laying my backing fabric over top of that with the right side facing up, trying to center those as best as possible. Once I found my center point on my backing fabric, I marked that and then lined it up with the center seam of my quilt. And then I'm going ahead and pinning those together along that seam. Now, since my backing fabric has an obvious vertical pattern, I wanted to make sure that vertical pattern aligned with the center column seam on my quilt top and that it wasn't veering off that. Now, typically when you make a quilt, you will have your backing fabric followed by your batting and then your quilt top, and you'll quilt those three layers together. I'm not including batting in my quilt because I found the t-shirts to be really heavy, like so much heavier than quilter's cotton, that I didn't want to add extra bulk or weight. So I just omitted the batting. So I just started by assembling these two layers by really securing them along that center line and then just kind of putting random pins on the rest of the quilt so it didn't shift too much. But I'm actually going to work on that center line first when I go to sew it. and then I go back to the floor and smooth out the backing and quilt top fabric, and then work on those two other vertical column lines next. I found it easier to sew if I was able to fold up the quilt as small as possible, as compact as possible. I don't have like a special sewing machine, it's just a regular one, so I needed to be able to fit the bulk of the quilt through that armhole on my sewing machine. For my quilt, I wanted to do my quilting lines in the ditch, so I'm stitching in the ditch. This meant that I needed the quilt top facing up. Now I know I pinned on the other side. This isn't typical, but I could feel those as I went along, and I just had to reach under and pull those pins out. Because my backing fabric was lighter, I opted for white thread, both the top and the bottom. You could certainly use different color threads for your top stitching and as well as your bobbin thread. Like you could do different ones, but I thought the white went with the t-shirts anyway, so I just used the same color. Once my vertical lines were stitched, I went ahead and quilted my horizontal lines. I wanted to make a note here that your quilt backing should be larger than your quilt top. And the reason for that is we're going to use the extra material from the quilt back and fold it over to enclose the raw edges around the quilt instead of using bias tape. Before you finish the raw edges, you may want to run a stitching line around the perimeter of the quilt to secure the edges to the backing fabric. This isn't necessary, it's up to you. I decided that I wanted the backing fabric to overlap the quilt top by 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to trim away the extra backing fabric, leaving 1.5 inches of that remaining. And the reason for that is once I fold it in half twice, I'll be left with a 1/4 inch that I can use to secure around the perimeter of the quilt. I found it easy to use a quilter's ruler as well as a rotary blade to do this, but you can certainly use a measuring tape and scissors if that's what you have. So to finish this off, I'm taking the outer edge of my backing fabric and I'm folding it in towards the quilt top so that the quilt top edge meets the edge of that backing fabric. Once that's folded, I then go ahead and fold it over once more so all of the raw edges are fully enclosed. I'm then pressing that down and pinning it in place. It's a good idea to measure as you go when you're doing this step so that your border is consistent. There are so many ways you can do your corner. You can simply just continue folding as you have been, tucking those raw edges in and having more of a square corner. But I wanted to miter mine. I don't know what this technique is. I kind of just like manipulated the fabric as I was going and figured out how to do it. So I'll let you watch the video here to learn how to do that. There's tons of videos on how to miter your corners. So if you need to refer to another one, go ahead. Once I was happy with how the corners were looking, I went ahead and pressed those and then pinned those in place. Some of them had a little bit of spacing, which I tried to pull close when I did my stitching line. Once your border is fully pinned in place around the perimeter of your quilt, you can go ahead and stitch that down. I opted to stitch as close to the folded edge as possible. It's up to you. I think it's nice to stitch close to that folded edge just so that you don't have like a flap of fabric that is loose. Then I went ahead and did a second stitching line. I found my corners weren't totally secure and I just also like the look of that second stitching line. It makes it more secure as well. Once your border is stitched down, the quilt is complete. If you'd like to see my husband's reaction to getting this gift on our anniversary, please head over to my Instagram. I'll be sharing that there. As well, I wanted to show you this is how the quilt is looking on our couch when I fold it up with the backside showing. If you found this video to be helpful or inspiring, I would really appreciate it if you could like or share this video, as well as if you'd like to see more videos from me, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching.